We're live, Warden Danielson.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second virtual open house to consider a draft shoreline preservation bylaw. I'd like to welcome both Jason Farragon and Grang Candlewall from J.L. Richards and Associates and Brent Parsons from Hutchinson Environmental Services to provide a detailed review of the science behind the need for such a bylaw, an environmental scan of other municipalities' similar work, and a fulsome consultative process prior to developing our new draft bylaw. Before we begin, I'd like to make a couple of comments. This meeting will be handled as a formal county council meeting with the appropriate resolutions attached. However, I would like to remind our listeners that councillors are in attendance only to listen to your comments and concerns, whether you're in support of or against certain aspects of what is being proposed. They will not be responding to questions. The initial draft remains on the county website as a reference for the public and stakeholders to see what's intended and respond to different aspects of the initial proposal. I want to be clear, however, that our consultants will only be using that document as a possible baseline and developing a new draft document for council's consideration in October. We have heard some concerns about the desire for offering PowerPoint presentations this evening and disappointment in not having that opportunity. Rather than it being a matter of expediency, although that certainly applies should we have a lot of delegations this evening, it's a matter of equitable treatment of all presenters. Those individuals making delegations at our initial meeting didn't have that opportunity, and we want to make sure that we offer fair and equitable treatment for all those who have comments that they wish to make. It is our hope to have our consultants develop a new draft bylaw that is fair to all parties to the greatest extent possible and easy to understand. Always recognizing the need for some legal speak in any bylaw that we adopt. We'd also like to provide a Coles Notes version to help in understanding the details of the final draft bylaw. With those comments, we'll get on with our official meeting, and I would ask our clerk to take a roll call, please.
Warden Danielson.
I'm here.
Councillor Moffat.
Present.
Councillor Roberts.
Here.
Councillor McKechnie.
Here.
Councillor Burton.
Here.
Councillor Ryle.
Here.
Councillor DeVolen.
Here.
And Councillor Schell.
Present.
Thank you.
Could I have a mover and a seconder to adopt the agenda for this evening? Councillor DeVolen and Councillor Burton. Thank you.
Moved by Councillor DeVolen, seconded by Councillor Burton. Be it resolved that the agenda for the September 29th, 2021 special meeting of Haliburton County Council be hereby approved.
All in favor? That's carried. Thank you. So we'll move right into the meat of the meeting and welcome Jason, Brent, and Grang to take over the meeting.
Well, thank you very much, Warden Danielson and members of council. We're very pleased to be here with you this evening and with members of your community in the second open house, as the warden mentioned, for the site alteration or shoreline preservation bylaw for the county. Maybe I'll ask my colleague, Mr. Candlewall, Grang, if you can call up the presentation, please. And if we could just move to the second slide, please, Grang. So before we jump into things and the conversation tonight, of course, we must begin with digital housekeeping protocols, if you will. So much like we did for the last open house, just to go over some protocols as it relates to Zoom. So if you have joined the meeting this evening and intend to speak, that's really great. And we look forward to sort of hearing your views. So we have a bit of a presentation tonight that we're going to go through. And at the end of the presentation, we have a list of approximately 12 individuals who have pre-registered to speak tonight. When we get to that portion of the agenda, we will bring each individual into the meeting when it's their turn to speak. Now, if you have pre-registered to speak, the display name that you see in Zoom right now should be the same as the name you provided when you registered to speak this evening. And that's important because it allows us to know who you are and when to bring you into the conversation. So if you need to update your display name, You can do so by clicking the participant button at the bottom toolbar, clicking on your name and then clicking rename. And then you just simply type in the new display name that you used when registering for the session tonight, and then you hit OK. So when you're called on to speak, please remember to unmute yourself using the mute unmute button at the bottom toolbar. And if you have a webcam enabled, you'll be visible with us, of course, on screen. So once everyone who has pre-registered to speak is finished, we're then going to open up the floor to anybody who has any additional comments that they wish to make. If you would like to speak at this segment during the open house, just please make sure to use the raise the hand feature within Zoom, and then we'll bring you into the meeting and we'll call upon you to speak. And of course, if you joined us tonight via phone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand. When called upon, Zoom will prompt you to unmute yourself by pressing *6 on your phone. And of course, should anybody have any technical challenges when we get there, we're here to sort of help you and sort of ensure that you do have an opportunity to provide your perspective on this very important initiative for the county. So Greg, if we can go down to the next slide, please, if that's okay. So in terms of our agenda tonight, and just sort of, I guess, building on Warden Danielson's opening remarks, what we want to do is sort of begin by sort of refreshing, you know, everyone in terms of the assignment that we've been tasked with by County Council. We'll then sort of move quickly into kind of the approach, providing a status update of where we are in the process. We've made considerable progress since first meeting County Council in June of this year. Next, we'll then talk about key findings from our last reports to County Council. So for those folks who may not have had a chance to review the reports yet, Brent, Andrea, Grang, and I will be touching on the key elements of those reports to kind of ground the conversation, if you will. From there, we're going to talk a little bit about some options for consideration within the new bylaw. And then there, we're going to stop our presentation and we're going to turn it over to you because we are here to sort of hear you tonight and to make sure that we're understanding your perspective as we're taking these next important steps in the development of the new shoreline preservation bylaw to the county. And then once we're done that, I can provide some comments in terms of wrap up and next steps. And then of course, I'll hand it back to Warden Danielson, who can sort of close the County Council meeting. Greg, maybe if we can move down to the next slide, please. So as Warden Danielson had mentioned, J.L. Richards and Hutchinson Environmental Sciences Limited have been retained to provide an independent and objective review of the draft shoreline bylaw that was previously developed by the county. So there were really sort of three components to that work: a scientific literature review, which we'll describe a little bit more tonight, successful municipal practices, which we'll touch on, and then of course moments like this in the conversation where we have an opportunity to hear from residents and stakeholders within the county on shoreline preservation generally, both pros and cons. We do realize that there are different perspectives on this initiative. And of course, as the warden had mentioned, which is not listed on this screen, but is an outcome of our process, we have been retained to prepare a new draft shoreline preservation bylaw for County Council's consideration. And that bylaw may contain elements of the former draft bylaw, and it may not, and it may contain new elements. So for folks that are looking at that draft bylaw that is online, that's great, because I think it reflects a point within the conversation, but certainly we are moving beyond that point in the conversation, and we'll be preparing a new draft bylaw for County Council to consider when we next meet with them in October. And I'll apologize to Mike March, who is actually operating the presentation. I thought it was Garang. So Mike, if we could move to the next slide, please. My apologies. So in terms of our approach, folks will recall that County Council has really sort of asked us to undertake this review using sort of two broad phases. And the first phase was the project startup, where we're kind of, taking a first look, beginning to wrap our heads and our arms around this question. And then the second phase, which is really sort of the deeper understanding of both the county shoreline preservation generally, the science, the municipal successful practices, and sort of working through that iterative process, both with the county residents and stakeholders to ultimately lead to the final report that will be presented to County Council later in October, which will include recommendations for a new draft bylaw for the county. So what we've highlighted on this screen, it just sort of shows you where we are in the process. And as you can sort of see, we've made considerable progress since our first conversation with County Council in June. And we're sort of getting towards the tail end of our original mandate as given to us by County Council. So we can go to the next slide, Mike, please. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues at Hutchinson Environmental Sciences Limited, Brent and Andrea, to walk us through sort of the key points that emerged from the scientific literature review that they had undertaken. And when they're complete, they're going to hand it back to me. And I'm going to walk through some of the key findings of both the policy review and the successful municipal practice scan that we undertook. So Brent, Andrea, maybe I can turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jason, and good evening, everyone. Happy to be here and happy to summarize the findings that we had from the scientific literature review. Just as a reminder, the literature review was focused on consultation with 6 North American experts in the field, and through the review of 60 peer-reviewed scientific papers, of which 46 were reviewed in detail. Through this work, we concluded that shorelines are highly productive biological hotspots that provide many ecological services, such as the protection of water quality, reduction of erosion and flood control, and wildlife habitat. Shorelines and the surrounding environment are actually often referred to as the ribbon of life because of the lopsided contribution they have to supporting biodiversity. For example, 9% of life in lakes, including fish, depend on shorelines for breeding, shelter, and foraging. Now, development can degrade natural shorelines and lake health through loss of vegetation, increase in impervious surfaces, pollution, or disturbance. These changes in sediment distribution and stability and nutrient levels and habitat can lead to increased nutrients in lakes and more frequent algae blooms through decreased water quality, and they can impact fish and other organisms. Climate change is amplifying many of these impacts on shorelines, especially where natural systems have been altered and hardened. Now, naturally vegetated land or natural buffers have to help to trap sediment and pollutants, moderate stormwater runoff and water temperature, and maintain wildlife habitat. They trap sediments through the plant's roots hold soil in place, and vegetation litter shields the ground from the direct impact of rain, which reduces erosion. There's obviously a filtering component of natural vegetation there. And native plants are preferable to manicured lawns because they're adapted to local conditions. They don't require the use of fertilizers, herbicides, or pesticides. They're better able to trap pollutants and runoff. They have deeper roots than a lawn would, so they can better stabilize shorelines. And they're generally avoided by geese or other nuisance species whose feces often act as a nutrient source in lakes, which in turn can increase the presence of algae blooms. Next slide, please, Mike. A couple of the general findings from the scientific literature review are that the design of buffers should be based on its function and performance goals, and that site conditions and adjacent land uses are incredibly important in determining buffer effectiveness. So that will be discussed on a later slide, but that's just a general takeaway from the scientific literature, and that not all buffers are made the same. Not all scientific documentation of their effectiveness is the same. It's dependent on the stressor under consideration and the site conditions that are there. Next slide, please. In terms of the key benefits associated with specific buffer widths, we summarize some of the key findings in this table that's continued on to the next slide. But as you'll see, for buffers that are less than 5 meters, they can be quite effective at nitrogen removal. Nitrogen removal is important as it's one of the nutrients that often limits the growth of plants and algae, but most of the time it's phosphorus that does that, but we still recorded the effectiveness of buffers in terms of nitrogen removal. At 10 meters, there's a 65% removal of sediment. The removal of sediment is important because it prevents loading of nutrients and contaminants that absorb to that sediment and solids that move down to the water course. It's important to prevent the covering of spawning grounds for fish, the entrainment of solids in fish gills, or the smothering of benthic invertebrates. 10 meters also provides 40 to 60% of the large woody debris input that would naturally occur in a forested system. Woody debris input is important as it provides shelter and spawning habitat for aquatic biota such as fish and benthic invertebrates. It promotes algae growth, periphyton growth at natural levels, which provides habitat and food sources for those aquatic species, and it forms the basis for aquatic food webs in a natural system. At 15 meters, a buffer often provides 60 to 85% of particulate organic matter. It's an important food source for filter feeding animals. It's a part of the carbon cycle, and again, it provides the balance in a natural system. At 15 meters, we also found that was a general takeaway from one of the papers that we read, which constituted a review of other papers. And in that paper, they found that 15 meters was the minimum buffer size sufficient for the protection of chemical and physical components of aquatic systems. So it's a more general takeaway, but the type of conclusions that help inform this study. And at 20 meters, we found that there was 85% removal of sediment. So as you can see, as you increase buffer size, you get greater buffer effectiveness in terms of water quality. And you'll see in the next slide on habitat provisions for various species. Next slide, please, Mike. So at 30 meters, we have up to 85% reduction of pollutants, including sediments, nutrients, and pesticides. At 28 meters, they found that there is 75% effective at nitrogen removal and 100% effective at providing large woody debris input. Buffers greater than 20 meter maintain water temperature of runoff within 2 degrees Celsius of a fully buffered watershed. And again, a couple of the summaries of the review papers that looked at buffer effectiveness noted that 30 meters was the minimum buffer size sufficient for the protection of biological components of aquatic systems. And another review paper noted that 30 meters was the average single recommendation for the protection of water quality. We also noted recommended buffer widths which are greater than 30 meters, and those often were related to wildlife habitat recommendations, such as a 50-meter terrestrial buffer beyond core habitat, which is often required for amphibians and turtles. At 40 meters, we note that there was 100% contribution of particulate organic matter, and that the diversity and abundance of macroinvertebrate and fish species at those buffer sizes generally reflected similar communities in fully forested watersheds. And again, one of the takeaways from the review papers was that the average single recommendation for the protection of habitat was 50 meters. Next slide, please, Mike. We also reviewed provincial guidance and guidance from the Ministry of Natural Resources and their Natural Heritage Reference Manual, and the Ministry of Environment's Guide to Development on Inland Lakes on the Precambrian Shield noted generally 30 meters from streams, warm water streams, cool water streams, cold water streams, with some exceptions for site-specific study where those buffer sizes could be decreased if it could be proven that there would be no negative impact. Other provincial guidance, such as the Greenbelt Plan and Oak Ridges Moraine, noted 30-meter buffers, as well as the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, which increased up to 100 meters outside existing settlement areas. Overall, the scientific literature demonstrates that a 30-meter buffer generally provides a range of ecological services. This buffer size is commonly recommended in the peer-reviewed literature focused on shoreline development, and it aligns with provincial guidance. Smaller buffers provide some benefits for water quality and habitat, The larger buffers provide more ecological services more completely. Next slide, please. And in terms of other considerations, the variable width approach has been applied by a few select conservation authorities in Ontario. And that's due to the fact that buffer effectiveness is dependent on site conditions. So in these areas, the conservation authorities will look at site conditions, whether it's slope or the type of soil or the type of vegetation that's in place, and scale the buffer size in accordance with the effectiveness it will have on that site. It's a bit of a challenge here because of the resources required to assess each site, but I wanted to note it for council and public, just in relation to the fact that, you know, the buffer effectiveness is dependent on these types of factors. Lake classification is often used as well, where lakes are grouped with similar features or management goals so that appropriate management tools such as buffer sizes can be applied. Again, it's challenging to determine the appropriate classification criteria for these types of lakes, but they often include water depth, flushing rate, trends in nutrient concentrations, etc. And then the most specific is lake-specific management plans, where individual lake plans are created to address local concerns. But again, it's not always easy to find consensus, and considerable resources are often required to develop these plans. I think that's back to you now, Jason. And thanks for the opportunity to summarize our findings tonight.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Brent. I really appreciate that. Mike, if we can go to the next slide, please. So while Brent and his team were looking at the scientific literature on shoreline buffers, Garang and I spent a considerable amount of time looking at the land use and the planning elements of this, together with sort of policy and the legislation. So we have an opportunity to look at the existing framework that applies within the County of Haliburton today as it relates to shoreline preservation. We've reviewed that framework, we've compared it to provincial law and policy, and then we've also compared it to the approaches that are used in other municipalities. So the next few slides sort of summarize the key results of that work and that research. So in terms of the existing framework, I think it is fair to say that the County of Haliburton and its lower tier municipalities have a very well established framework to protect shorelines in effect today. And so if you look at the county's official plan, it says that a 30-meter setback is required, both in terms of site alteration, vegetation protection, and development. And it gives direction to the local municipalities to implement similar policies within their documents. So that framework, as I've mentioned, does apply to 30-meter shoreline today, with some exceptions. Of course, when you look at the local official plans, there is some flexibility that is provided for lots that were created at a certain point in time in the past. So there's a recognition there within the local municipal official plans that the existing lot fabric may not be well suited to the 30-meter shoreline area setback in all instances. So the framework applies to both new development and to tree removal. It's important to note, I guess, that the county does have a tree preservation bylaw that is in effect today, and that also applies to the 30-meter shoreline preservation area. In terms of when you look at that framework, it does permit certain activities to occur, and within that sort of preservation area. And the exceptions to those activities sort of vary community by community. So the local municipalities have sort of tailored what we're referring to as activity standards to the unique needs of each of their communities. And of course, there's varied application requirements, understanding that we're talking about a tree bylaw together with official plans and zoning bylaws as well. When you look at the governance and the decision-making for the existing framework today, there are opportunities for both councils at the upper and lower tier level, as well as the lower tier committees of adjustments, to provide relief from the standards that are in effect within the existing framework, subject to, say, for example, site conditions, the nature of the development that is being proposed, or additional information that is being brought forward in the form of site evaluations, as an example. So those mechanisms are within the existing framework today. And of course, as it relates to trees and the enforcement of other zoning bylaws within the county and its lower tier partners rely on complaint-based enforcement, or monitoring and compliance would be another way of saying that. And that's not unusual when you look at municipalities across Ontario. Many municipalities will look at monitoring and compliance based on feedback that they receive from the local community. So we can move to the next slide, please, Mike. So this slide reads the proposed bylaw, but it should read the former proposed bylaw. So we spent some time looking at the bylaw that was previously developed by the county, and we've sort of summarized our perspective on the bylaw here. And when we look at the bylaw, it's clear to us that what the bylaw was attempting to do was to build on the existing framework that the county and its lower tier partners already had in effect to preserve that 30-meter shoreline preservation area on lakes and other water bodies across the county. What the bylaw did is it was maintaining the requirements as it related to new development within that area and the preservation of trees within that area. And what it was attempting to do really was to add requirements relating to vegetation as well as topography, utilizing the municipality's authority under the Municipal Act to regulate site alteration. So the proposed bylaw, of course, continued to apply to the established 30-meter setback area. But what it did is it created a uniform standard, and Brent spoke to this earlier a little bit. So it created a uniform 30-meter standard for all water bodies across the county. And it didn't provide many opportunities or recognition of, the varied site conditions that are experienced across the county today. And by varied site conditions, I mean the difference between managed lakes that are part of the Trent Severn waterway system versus lakes that are not. Also sites that may have steep slopes or that have development on them today, or relatively narrow frontages on the water, or lot depths back to the road. The bylaw did allow for some exceptions. So for example, within the bylaw, there was an exception if an individual was building a home, an area 5 meters surrounding the home was not subject to the requirements of the bylaw. There were similar provisions relating to the creation of new driveways, minor landscaping, and similar activities. And importantly, I guess a key difference is that the draft bylaw proposed an application-based process, which differs from the process that's in effect today for the tree bylaw. So that was a significant service level change. And the bylaw did allow for limited relief from the provisions of the bylaw, both in terms of staff exercising that relief, but also council. So the example there that comes to mind is within the draft bylaw, if an applicant had been refused a permit under the new bylaw, they would have an opportunity to appeal that refusal, if you will, to county council and have the matter considered by them. Mike, if we can go to the next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, we did take the opportunity to compare the draft bylaw against the approaches that were being undertaken by many other municipalities in Ontario, approximately 10. Mike, if we can go back one, please. And what we found there in that particular case is that the approach that was being taken by the county was consistent with the approach taken within other municipalities, understanding, of course, that there's always going to be some variation in approach based on either the strategic objectives of a council, the capacity that exists within the community or the municipality to administer the bylaw, and the unique nature of the community itself. So understanding those three things and then reflecting on sort of our analysis. When we spoke with County Council last month, we had indicated to them that we had identified at least 9 opportunities to improve the former proposed bylaw, consistent with the objectives that Warden Danielson had sort of stated earlier in terms of creating a fair bylaw for everyone, something that is easy to understand, but that is enforceable at the same time. So our recommendation is that there are opportunities to create a plainer language bylaw by implementing many of the suggested improvements that have been brought to our attention by stakeholders, members of the public. There's an opportunity to align the bylaw with the in effect planning policy within the county. There's an opportunity to create, in our minds, a consistent area of application, and we're going to talk about this in a second. There's an opportunity to harmonize, again, to the extent possible with local requirements, understanding that there will be a relationship between the proposed bylaw, if it is implemented by County Council, and the local municipal official plans and the local municipal zoning requirements. And that's a very important piece. And we want to make sure that we get that piece right in our recommendations. There's an opportunity clearly to recognize and provide flexibility, we believe, for the varied site conditions that exist throughout the county. There's also an opportunity to use more performance-based standards where it's appropriate to do so in the bylaw. So there are certain instances in the former proposed draft where it creates sort of regulations that don't provide for much flexibility. We understand the outcome that the bylaw is attempting to achieve through those requirements, and we think there's an opportunity to reframe those into more performance-based standards, if you will. There are opportunities to review and streamline the application requirements associated with the bylaw as well, and to broaden the matters that can be referred back to council. And lastly, there is an opportunity to create a reasonable transition framework. Currently, the bylaw is silent on transition, and normally when we're creating new regulation and new policies, we're mindful of how it is going to play out when it is implemented. And typically a bylaw will include a transition framework that allows the community and the municipalities to grow into the new service that's being proposed within that bylaw. Mike, if I can go to the next slide, please. So having said that, we did receive some really great feedback from County Council in our last discussion with them, and we've received some really good feedback from stakeholders that we've managed to connect with since the last County Council meeting in this open house tonight on those recommendations, and we certainly appreciate that feedback. And so now we're at the stage where we're beginning to draft the new bylaw requirements, and there's some things that we're considering in terms of options, which we will sort of present as options to County Council. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about those. This is not to say that this is going to be our recommendation. These are just things that we are reviewing and considering as we are formulating the new bylaw for County Council's consideration. And if we would welcome feedback on these points tonight, if it's provided by folks that have registered or are willing to sort of join the conversation later. So the first one is, as I mentioned earlier, the consistent area of application. And when you spend time looking at the county's official plan and the lower tier municipal documents, you come to the realization that they say different things in terms, or slightly different things, I should say, in terms of where shoreline preservation should be applied within the county. The county's OP is very clear, is that shoreline preservation should apply to lakes, rivers, and streams, and that's logical, and that's consistent with the approach that we see taken in other communities. But there are other policy statements that suggest that the bylaw should also apply to other bodies of water that are permanently covered by water. And an example of that would be sort of a pond, which may be surrounded by a wetland. And we know that County Council has had an opportunity to previously reflect on this question, and had included ponds in the earlier draft. Notwithstanding that, we do want to sort of take a look at that aspect of the bylaw to ensure that we are able to come back to County Council with really great information in that area. So if anybody has any feedback on things like ponds and wetlands, we're certainly open to hearing that feedback as well. The next slide, please, Mike. So as Brent mentioned in his summary, when you look at shoreline buffers and the scientific evidence behind it, it's clear that various shoreline buffer widths provide various, I like the way that Brent put it, a range of ecological services and a range of ecological benefits to the community. And when we looked at other municipalities, those municipalities have also, looking at their communities, have implemented approaches where in some cases they're applying the shoreline buffer to 30 meters, and in some cases they're applying it to a shorter distance. So this slide shows an aerial image from another community that JLR is currently working in. And what we've illustrated on this is three sort of bands, if you will, of shoreline preservation. The first band is 10 meters, The second band is 20 meters, and the third band is 30 meters. And we know from our conversations with folks and from reading the materials that we've been receiving, and we were clear with this when we spoke to County Council last month and in our report, is there are varied perspectives on what is the appropriate width of a shoreline buffer within Haliburton County. So we put this on the table because we want to continue to hear feedback on that. Is 10 meters appropriate from your perspective? Is 20 meters appropriate from your perspective? Or is 30 meters appropriate from your perspective? We continue to want to hear your sort of views on that. The next slide, Mike, please. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are opportunities within the bylaw to create flexibility to account for the varied site conditions that exist within the county. So just by chance, this slide actually shows various lots that have various depths. And as you sort of see, what we're trying to highlight on this slide is, in some cases, you're dealing with small lots when you're talking about shoreline buffer areas. So that's the lot on the right-hand side of the screen, which has, if you look very closely at that image, a detached residential structure that sits somewhere between the 20 and the 30 meter band for shoreline preservation, versus a larger, deeper developed lot where the principal dwelling unit is located outside of the 30 meter buffer area. And that is illustrated in the center portion of the slide. And then, of course, a larger undeveloped lot towards the left hand of the side, where if someone comes forward in the future to develop the lot, it is easier to achieve a 30 meter setback in that instance because the development is occurring after the new policy or the new regulation comes into effect. So having said that, we need to take into account all of these considerations when we're creating the new bylaw for the county. And when you look at the local municipal official plans, there are precedents for providing flexibility to account for varied site conditions, assuming, of course, that no matter what happens on the property, there is a net overall gain. And so that is something that we are considering in terms of an improvement for the bylaw. Next slide, please, Mike. And then, of course, there's transition. And so I spoke about the importance of transition and sort of growing in to both a new regulation and a new service level. And there are different ways that you can create transition frameworks. And this slide and the next slide will illustrate two conceptual approaches. So the first approach would be to create a relatively complex transition framework that would establish a 30 meter setback for all new development within the county, or to maintain, the existing 30 meter setback, and to implement a 10 meter buffer in year 1, a 20 meter buffer in year 2, a 30 meter buffer in year 3 and beyond. All the while, and this is something that we heard both from the community and from County Council the last time that we spoke to them, all the while continuing both education and incentives and compliance monitoring. So there is a way to create a transition framework to implement the bylaw over a number of years. And as part and parcel of that, there's also an opportunity to consider how the county transitions from its non-permit based system where it is today towards more of a formalized permit-based system. So we haven't sort of concluded our thought process on that. And we would certainly welcome any feedback on this model of transition. And Mike, if we can go to the next slide. And we would also welcome feedback, and we've started to hear feedback on this model of transition. So the other way to do the transition is to say, well, in year 1, the 30 meter setback remains, the existing 30 meter buffer remains, together with education, incentives, compliance, and monitoring. And then what happens is, instead of modifying the standard and growing into the standard over time, we look at the submission requirements for the permit-based system, and we start with what I would describe as modified requirements in the first year to make sure that folks are getting in the door, they get some customization, to the requirements, both from the development community, the property owner, and the municipal staff perspective. They go through a year of implementation. There's an opportunity to pause, to reflect on lessons learned. And then the standards are changed in year 1 as the community moves towards a more fulsome set of requirements. This transition framework that I'm describing here is one that is used commonly in other municipalities. It is one that I have experience with from a former role. And the benefit of that framework is that it allows the public policy objective to be achieved while providing the community and the municipality opportunity to take steps together to understand how this new service is going to be delivered. So we certainly would welcome any feedback on this second transition framework as well. The next slide, Mike, please. So that is it from Brent and Andrea and Garang and I, and now this is our opportunity where we are very much looking forward to, which is get to hear from you. And we welcome all comments, either on the work that we've done to date or the information that we've presented this evening. We understand that the information that we've presented is new, but we felt that it was important to present to you where we were in our thinking today on the initiative. So, of course, this isn't going to be the only opportunity that folks have to provide their comments to us. It is just one opportunity. So if thoughts come up after the meeting tonight, and if you have additional points that you'd like to raise with us, by all means, please do send them to us via email. So with that, Mike, if I can, I'll move to the registered list of speakers, and maybe we can start bringing folks into the room. The first individual that I have on the list is Deborah Bassler. If you could bring Deborah in, please.
Deborah's not actually on the call tonight, so I will be bringing in Doug Lennart.
Great, thank you, Mike. Hi, Doug.
Hi.
Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. So we can hear you great.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak at this open house. I actually like the format of this one better than the last one, where I don't think any information was presented before we had a chance to speak. Now, unfortunately, I've never received acknowledgement that my comments that I submitted by email on August 18th had been received by either any of the consultants or the committee members. So following my comments, I'll be reading 7 pages in, I guess, to get them on record. Based on your August 25th meeting, I understand we're comparing ourselves to other municipalities. And many of these municipalities that are offering something similar with 30-meter setback also allow the construction of boathouses. So I presume that as part of this, auxiliary buildings like boathouses will now be allowed as part of the building and zoning requirements, since we want to be just like those other municipalities. I was quite interested in the MOE lake capacity study information, which basically shows a sliding scale of the loading and usage between seasonal, extended seasonal, and permanent usages on the lake, which is becoming something that's happening in terms of changes as we see a lot more people move from single season dwellings to permanent homes and permanent rental facilities, which means we have a greater need to address some of those properties more than potentially true seasonal residences. I'm going to focus, I know somebody else is on the call to focus on some of these other items, but I'm going to focus on a single item in the proposed bylaw, which is Schedule A. I picked on Schedule A because Schedule A is basically a polite way of creating a system that is so prohibitively expensive and complicated that the most simple addition or alteration to a residence, existing residence within the setback zone, whatever it turns out to be, 10 meters, 20 meters, 30 meters, becomes so expensive that it basically prohibits people from doing any modification. So for example, items 1 to 6 of Schedule A basically require a surveyor. I've priced it out for my particular lot, and that cost will be over $20,000. Item 7, which is the identification of predominant soil types across the lot, will probably require a geotechnical survey. The usefulness of this, I kind of scratch my head over, because it basically, from what I understand of lake capacity study, there's really only 2 types of conditions that matter, which is either you've got deep soil or you've got shallow soil. And neither of these requirements seem to make any sense associated with how does that affect the permit approval. Item 8, which is a location of each and every tree and shrub on the 100-foot or 30-meter area around the development, becomes hugely expensive. In a previous role, I had the opportunity to get involved in one of these surveys, and the cost of that, to hire the surveyor, the arborist, to tag and identify and measure each tree, was over $75,000. The location, dimension of the storm management systems, et cetera, all start adding to the tab. So before you're out of the gate, you're well over $100,000 of expense. And if you're going to put on a 12 by 12 addition on the back of your cottage, which happens to be within this buffer zone, are you really serious about needing over $100,000 worth of consultancy done to be able to accomplish it? So I really question the whole value of Schedule A as part of this bylaw. In addition, references were made to what vegetations were going to be approved in earlier presentations. And I was quite surprised that many of the much of the push for this vegetation are shrubbery and maturing tree species, which is not necessarily going to meet the requirements that Brent laid out earlier in his presentation about what we're trying to accomplish on this. So that's my those are those comments. Now, before I start reading my 7 pages here on the email, have you or have you not received my previous email?
Doug, we have, and my apologies for that. So I've called your email up on the 19th. It was sent to Garang and I would admit we've been a bit challenged in certain cases to reply back to everyone.
Okay, that's fine.
But the non-reply is not to ignore the submission. We have reviewed everything that has come in. We just we didn't hit reply on that one. So yes, we do have it.
Okay.
So no need to sort of read it tonight.
Okay, I will stand down on that, and I'll let you move on to your next presenter.
Okay, but before you go, Doug, I just wanted to thank you for your comments. And I think, the points that you've identified with respect to Schedule A, when I was giving my presentation and talking about streamlined application requirements,
yes,
those were some of the things that we were sort of thinking about as well, and some feedback that we've heard from folks and other stakeholders too. So we appreciate you bringing that forward, and I would expect that the next iteration of the bylaw that you'll see will have different application requirements associated with it.
That's great, because I also kind of liked your conversation about performance-based rather than prescription-based.
Yeah, understood.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you,
I'm
Doug.
off.
I really appreciate it.
Okay.
So Mike, next we have Connor Harris. Is Connor with us tonight?
Connor is, and I'll be bringing him in just one moment.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly, Connor. Welcome.
Perfect. Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Connor Harris. I'm a lawyer here to provide comments on behalf of my client, BlackRock Landscapes, Inc. To provide you with a bit of context about who my client is and sort of the perspective as to where these comments are coming from. BlackRock is a leading landscape design and construction company. It's based in Haliburton. It's been in business for more than 20 years and is run by the husband and wife team of Mr. Don Woodstra and Ms. Geraldine Woodstra. It's developed an excellent reputation as a leader in the landscape contracting industry, and it employs a sizable permanent and seasonal workforce to work on its projects and has responsibility for projects that run into the millions of dollars annually, and has worked on hundreds of different properties throughout the county of Haliburton and the surrounding area. Provides a full suite of services from the initial design and planning of its projects through to final construction and maintenance. As part of the services it provides, it seeks to be environmentally conscious. It has extensive experience in drainage and erosion control works and has corrected and mitigated those issues in the course of many of the projects it has undertaken. The works that it performs and the projects that it builds, it strives that they have little to no adverse environmental impact on the surrounding environment, including particularly lakes and shorelines or other waterways and water features. And the projects typically enhance the natural environment while helping property owners to beautify their properties. Because of that concern for environmental consciousness, I want to stress, and my client BlackRock wants to stress, that it's not opposed at all to the county's goals in pursuing a shoreline preservation bylaw from a high level, and it supports the goals of avoiding adverse impacts on the environment that it understands are a large part of the motivation of this process. But the reason for these comments and the reason for its involvement here today is that BlackRock believes that those concerns cannot be looked at to the exclusion of everything else. Needs to be balanced appropriately with economic impacts as well as the rights of private property owners. As originally drafted, and I can appreciate that there will be a new draft bylaw coming forward, but as originally drafted, the bylaw would have serious negative impacts on BlackRock's business as well as the rights of property owners that were subject to it. In BlackRock's view, it was unduly prescriptive, and the permitting requirements, which at first blush would appear to apply to the vast majority of the projects BlackRock works on, were unduly onerous. And this was mentioned quite ably in the submissions of the previous speaker. Those requirements from a high level would render many of the projects BlackRock undertakes uneconomical and therefore unlikely to proceed. The requirements for extensive and costly studies or other documentation by various professionals, such as environmental engineers, landscape architects, would incur costs that are disproportionate to the value of the projects being pursued, and in BlackRock's view, amounts to essentially prohibition by way of regulation. Most owners would not want to and would not be able to incur those costs, particularly if it is uncertain whether a permit will be granted after the costs spent. And this is important in BlackRock's view because there's been discussion about potential renaturalization requirements, which, as the bylaw is drafted, would engage the permitting requirements and so would hamper even that goal of the process. And I should emphasize again, BlackRock doesn't necessarily oppose a permitting process or a permit-based system in principle, but in its view, it needs to be a workable, practical, consistent system that is proportionate to the projects that it's regulating. And it must also respect the overlapping jurisdictions. It's just a natural sort of outgrowth when dealing with shorelines and watercourses that not only is the municipal jurisdiction going to be engaged, but also federal and provincial jurisdictions and requirements as well. So whatever is passed ultimately by the county needs to be respectful of those overlapping jurisdictions and ensure that it's not duplicative of existing regulations from those other levels of government. That's why BlackRock and these concerns are why BlackRock has been actively engaged in this process, met with the county's consultants, provided feedback on the approach that is being taken, particularly with respect to the potential for a workable implementation process that ensures public awareness as well as public acceptance of the new requirements. And so far, I'll speak frankly, that process has given BlackRock cause for optimism that these concerns are being considered and will be fully incorporated into the final product when it's considered by council. BlackRock remains hopeful that the policy recommended will be consistent, workable, and proportionate to the concerns raised, and will incorporate these concerns, and is hopeful that it can continue to work within that process to assist in any way that it can. And I thank you for your time and for considering these comments.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Connor. We appreciate you coming tonight to share your clients' views. Thank you. So Mike, up next, we have Tace Wakefield. Is Tace with us this evening?
Yes, and I'll be bringing her in 1 moment.
Great. Thank you, Mike.
There you
There you go.
Yeah, you're fine.
Good evening, all. Good evening, councillors, and good evening to the community. And thank you for allowing me to present this evening. We are the owners of the waterfront properties whose property rights are under discussion here. I am working with a group of owners of 150 properties on the Kinesis Lakes and other Haliburton lakes. We have grown from about 15 in late July as more and more people, more and more property owners become aware about what is being proposed and the implications. We have provided 3 thoughtful and constructive submissions in the past 60 days. Our objective is to provide thoughtful and constructive input. We too have not received acknowledgement from consultants that our submissions have been read or received. They didn't hit reply to us 3 times. We most recently provided a 12-page input on the consultants' reports and recommendations for a fairer, more effective bylaw on September the 1st. I'll cover the highlights of that this evening. We were one of the ones who asked for equitable treatment for the taxpayers with the consultants by allowing us to use PowerPoint charts as well. We regret that we were not allowed to do so. Our purpose in asking to use charts was that, in our experience, it is the norm for meetings of this type, and it helps to make a clearer and more focused presentation, particularly where you have connectivity challenges, which we sometimes do. So we regret that we were not allowed to do so. It does cause us to question how interested you are in receiving thoughtful input from property owners. We did distribute our charts yesterday afternoon to the councillors. We posted it on our Facebook page. So we hope that some people have had the opportunity to get our charts. We will be using them as a framework for our presentation this evening. And so we would encourage you to follow along with those if you can. We appreciate the overview that the consultants gave. Unfortunately, we will not be providing responses to the options that they presented. I think we would, as I said, like to provide thoughtful input. So I'd like to take it under advisement, discuss the things that have been presented, and then come back with thoughtful input on those. Some of what we will cover tonight does actually go to some of the options you discussed, but that's by circumstance rather than because of an extemporaneous response. So let me start perhaps with Appendix G. It's hard to see me holding it up. The list of stakeholder interviewees. We note that to put this report together, the consultants met with 14 members of municipal government, 12 business people, 3 environmental non-governmental organization representatives, 3 representatives of people involved in the Trent Severn Coalition, and exactly 0 waterfront property owners, the people most affected. Now, some of those other people may in fact own waterfront property, but they were not consulted in their capacity as waterfront property owners. So we regret that our input was not sought. Turning to the state of the science, We have not read all 46 papers that were referenced. However, we have read several of them and considered other sources as well. I want to make several key points, extracts from the report. And this is, again, where PowerPoint would be helpful because you could see what I'm referring to. But in the executive summary, it says, quote, "The scientific literature on shoreline buffers over the past 30 years has largely focused on watercourses and wetlands and the impacts of agriculture and forestry. Relatively little research has examined buffer performance in protecting lakes from shoreline development." In other words, there is no or not much data available, but we regret that there was not a recommendation made to research this issue to get real data to really understand what's happening. I want to highlight another quote at page 8. Quote, no single type or size of buffer will perform optimally in all conditions. And determination of buffer characteristics should consider a variety of factors." And it goes on to talk about what those factors might be. In fact, the single most important point I took from the State of the Science report was that no one size fits all solution is available here. At page 22, the report says, quote, "Numerous researchers thus advocate a more flexible approach in delineating buffer size. Yet the fixed width approach is typically used by planning authorities because it requires less technical knowledge and is more easily enforced." So a single buffer, wide buffer isn't right. It's just easier to administer, if I can paraphrase. And at page 25, quote, "Lake classification is an effective management tool because it's not a one size fits all approach, and individual characteristics of the lake watershed, existing development, and social factors can be accounted for across a large area." To summarize that, tailoring regulation to individual shoreline characteristics makes sense to do. So based on what I've read from the State of the Science, some of the papers that we reviewed, I'd like to just talk about what do buffers try to accomplish. The core objective, of course, is good water quality. And we all, of course, want good water quality. Natural shorelines are one contributor, but they can't do it all. It's very important that we address point loading at source and not count on the buffers to do everything. Buffers also provide wildlife habitat at water's edge, as Mr. Perrigan detailed. In fact, my Love Your Lake individual report says, quote, "The first 10 to 15 meters of land that surround lakes and rivers are responsible for 90% of lake life, which is born, raised, and fed in these areas." So the area immediately above and below the water line is most important for habitat. As noted by Mr. Farragon or the other gentleman whose name is escaping me, they also filter and remove sediment. We note that sediment is not such a big issue for most county lakes due to thin soil cover and no agricultural tillage. Shoreline buffers also remove nitrogen from fertilizer where lawn and agriculture abuts lakes. Unfortunately, the proposed regulation bylaw, the previous proposal, does nothing to replace those lawns with natural vegetation. And again, point loading is important. It would be better to address fertilizer use from agricultural lawns through direct restrictions rather than counting on shoreline buffers to do the job. When it comes to nutrient flows of phosphorus and nitrogen, again, it's important to make a distinction based on our reading of the literature between underground flow that might come from a properly functioning septic. Our read of the literature shows that 10-meter buffers are adequate for this. I refer in particular to the charts at the back of the Schindler paper, and make the distinction with the difference for surface flow of phosphorus, and that's what would come from malfunctioning septics. In fact, you do need for septics that aren't working more of a filter, but why not make sure the septics are working properly by having a rigorous reinspection program rather than allowing that effluent to flow across the land and into the water. I think it's important also to think about what the desktop review didn't consider. The first is the actual state of our shorelines. It would appear from some of the comments in the report that the consultants, unfortunately, didn't seem to have the chance to get out to visit some of our beautiful Haliburton lakes. I refer, for example, to the quote at page 3 of the executive summary, where they say, quote, natural shoreline vegetation is commonly cleared during development and replaced partially or completely by manicured lawn. This may be true of some areas on some lakes, but it's not true for the great majority of Haliburton County lakes. And I would invite the consultants to come visit us on Kinesis, where there are certainly a handful of lawns, but the majority of us do not have lawns. I think it's important not to allow these kinds of assumptions or maybe what you see when you drive through Minden or Haliburton on Head Lake or the Gull River to color your view of the entire 600 lakes in Haliburton County. In fact, one of the things we looked at, which you didn't, was the 2019 Lake Health Report for the Haliburton Highlands. We found it a very useful source to understand really what was happening on many of the lakes. That report looked at, I think, about roughly half of the larger lakes in the county. And looking at it, 38% of the properties on lakes had shorelines that were over 75% natural or regenerative, which is one of the bylaw's objectives. About 30% were close in that 70 to 75% natural or regenerative range. And about a third were at risk, were lower than the 70%. But again, we note that the bylaw does nothing to restore natural shoreline on these lakes, which are in fact most at risk. I'd also just like to highlight a couple of other questions that came up as we were reading some of the studies. One of the ones I found interesting was Schindler identified problems where flow through was impeded. In other words, lakes were dammed up and artificially held back. They found that cutting the flow through by 50% was the equivalent of adding the point load, doubling the point load. I think that has important implications for those of us that are on Trent Severn Reservoir lakes and warrants further consideration in this policymaking process. I believe it was also Schindler who identified that phosphorus from road treatment can be a problem point load. And I think that's another area where researchers are required because there are a number of lakes in Haliburton County that have roads that go immediately adjacent to the high water mark and where winter road treatment may put those at risk. So I'd just like to flag some of the questions that I think remain to be answered before we proceed too rapidly with solutions. Moving on to the background and directions report.
Sorry, Tace, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but I'm wondering how many other points you have on the background report, because I'm just trying to be mindful of time and we're nearing the 12 to 13 minute mark. Yeah, I want you to continue, but I wanted to sort of get a sense from you about how much longer you have to go.
I think I'm about halfway, in fact. So when I asked for space to speak this evening, I did say that there were several of us that were interested, but that I wasn't sure whether we would all speak or that I would speak on behalf of them. So I hope that I'll be allowed to complete my remarks, given that we do represent 150 taxpayers and you haven't talked to us before. Thank you.
No, Tace, yeah, for sure. I'm just being mindful of time, that's all. And I'm curious. So please continue. Sorry to interrupt you.
Thank you. We were interested, the background report showed that 49% of land in Haliburton County is privately owned. We note that the proposal does not apply to Crown land, municipal land, gravel pits, quarries, forestry operations, but only really to the 15,000 residential lots within 30 meters of water. And of those, only 15% are vacant. We note that most of the tree cutting and vegetation removal occurs when a lot is developed. Some can occur later, but most is either when it's developed or renoed. We note that there are now only about 2,300 vacant lots in Haliburton. And so we think it's probably important to focus some attention on that, but probably unfair to curtail our property rights on all of us that own properties that are already developed. And once again, we make the point that the anybody that owns a lot on a lake that is has a compromised shoreline, say less than 70%, this isn't going to do anything to help them. Also like to look at Appendix I briefly. It produced some interesting results. This was the one about the results of the community survey. The dominant themes that we took away, answers to almost every question actually. The first was concern over lax enforcement of the existing regulations. The second was that many respondents found that other issues such as effective septic reinspection programs, addressing fertilizer, the point loading issues in particular should be higher priorities than this buffer. The key finding was that over 60% of respondents said natural vegetation should be less than 5 meters or 5 to 10 meters. Only 15% called for 21 to 30 meters and less than 8% said over 30 meters. So the public's view on this is very clear. Just briefly to touch on some other concerns, we thought it was curious that the consultants recommended removing the only quantified objectives in the draft bylaw. We think that the 75% natural native vegetative contiguous cover and the 50% high quality natural vegetative cover should remain. Despite the very large portion of our lakes that already exceed these goals, we argue for retaining these quantitative benchmarks to measure progress. We are still looking for a legal opinion as to whether the Planning Act is the most appropriate legal authority, not the Municipal Act here. We note that the Planning Act does provide authority for shorelines, so we think that it might be the more appropriate one. Like several of our previous speakers, we ask why the bylaw needs to be so permit intensive, so administrative intensive, so paperwork intensive, so cost intensive. And we would still like to see detailed the criteria for consideration of applications and the process for appeal. We noted in the comparison of other jurisdictions that there seemed to be a mix of shoreline bylaws, setbacks, of different distances. We found it curious that Kawartha Lakes to our immediate south wasn't one of the comparators, where there are others much further away that were used as comparisons. We believe that Kawartha Lakes does not have a shoreline bylaw. We do note that Kawartha Conservation, however, has a program to offer grants to landowners to renaturalize shorelines. So it's a completely different model. I'm not sure it's one that we would recommend, but we think that if we're doing a comparison of what's used in other jurisdictions, we should at least look at that and understand the pros and cons. So to sum up, virtually everyone, warrant everyone, wants good water quality and natural shorelines. The question here is what policy framework will best restore shorelines that have been compromised and maintain ones that are healthy today, ideally while respecting existing private property rights. Our read of the science does not call for a single 30-meter buffer. The science does certainly call for focusing on reducing point loading of nutrients from septics and fertilizers. We already have 30-meter setbacks for new lots, new septics, tree cutting. It's not clear what value the administrative intensive permit process will add. We would instead encourage you to up the enforcement of existing laws and increase fines if necessary, and also encourage the other jurisdictions involved, the feds and the prov, to ensure that they're taking proper enforcement. So let's just recap briefly. The objective is clean water. The threat is phosphates and nitrogen from malfunctioning septics, fertilizer, maybe road runoff, and maybe not allowing the free flow through of reservoir lakes. This proposal is to make the filter denser, not stop the pollution at source, and not restore the filter where it's been removed. We think that's wrong-headed, expensive, intrusive, and won't do the job. What do we think we should do? Here are our recommendations for a fairer, more effective bylaw. First of all, stop the pollution at source with rigorous septic inspections and limits on fertilizers. Then establish a 3-part shoreline plan. 1, establish a 10-meter buffer zone on all lakes where a maximum of 20% of the vegetation can be removed, and require permits, a simple permit process, for new vegetation removal or site alteration on already developed lots in this zone that go above that 20% threshold. 2, require site plans for new lot development and significant renos to ensure that clearing in that case is limited to less than 20% of the shoreline. Again, we listen to our friends in the site services, home building, landscaping community, and agree that those should be high-level plan requirements, not the minutia level that's in the appendix that Mr. Leonard referred to. And there should be flexibility to adjust when site conditions warrant. Talking to one of our contractors here, he advised me how often it is that they think they have a plan, they put the shovel in the ground, and they find that there isn't soil there, or there's more soil, or something else is warranted. And to have to go back and do the whole re-permit thing again is just not feasible. In fact, this might actually be better done at the lower tier as part of the building permit process, rather than having a second duplicative layer at the upper tier. And then the third part of the 3-part shoreline plan would be for those under 70% natural shoreline lakes, the ones that really are at risk here. We think it should be a priority to establish plans to renaturalize the shorelines on those lakes to 75% or above. Of course, this proposal does nothing towards that. That includes, as you said, providing education and expertise on how to renaturalize, where to access native species, and programs to reward good actors with positive recognition and possibly incentives. So to wrap it up, we think that there's an opportunity here for a fairer, more balanced approach that would be more acceptable to those of us that are concerned waterfront property owners. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you very much, Tace. We appreciate the feedback that you've provided, and we'll make sure to take that into consideration as we go forward. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
So Mike, up next we have Nancy Barnes, I believe.
Yes, we do.
Thank you, Mike.
Hello?
Hi, Nancy. Can you hear us okay?
I can. Yes, thank you.
Perfect.
Well, this process is very new to me, but I felt very strongly about what I'm about to present. I know that Tace mentioned septic fertilizers, but she didn't mention pesticides to protect our buffer zone. And that's what I'd like to speak about tonight. An environmental precaution to put into the bylaw. It's probably something that people haven't thought about. I don't know if I haven't actually read the current bylaw that you have so far. But when I saw the opportunity to speak, I thought I should put forward my thoughts on the issue. The increasing use of permethrin as a toxic chemical, pesticide, used to minimize mosquitoes in cottage country. It is an emerging threat to aquatic organisms, fish, birds, bees, beneficial insects, etc. If the companies using permethrin do not follow Canada's federal policies regarding its use, we will eventually see a loss of life in our ribbon of life. I don't know how many here are aware that if you spray or have sprayed by a company using a product containing permethrin to minimize mosquitoes on your property, you are also killing the bees, the beneficial insects, the pollinators, the butterflies that come in contact with the product. It is also toxic to fish, birds, and aquatic organisms. For this reason, I am recommending that you put a section in the new bylaw using Canada's policies for its use. And I'll just stop my presentation here just to comment on the fact that the buffer zones that you mentioned tonight, the 10, the 20, the 30, if I was making a choice for direct, what would you call it, direct restrictions, I would restrict the use in the 30 meters. Canada has suggested 10 meters, and most of that has to do with big operations, things like greenhouses, crop spraying. Up here, the mosquito companies, or the companies bringing in mosquito sprays now to help make it more like the city, no mosquitoes, it'll cause us problems. So to continue, for this reason, I'm recommending a section in the Shoreline Bylaw using Canada's policy for its use of permethrin surrounding our bodies of water, which include lakes, streams, marshes, bogs, and the like. Canada's policy requires a 10-meter vegetative filter strip buffer zone to minimize the risk to the aquatic environment. In PEI, it is 15 meters for all of PEI. Canada recommended this 10 meter, saying this was the best overall for all of Canada. But you can understand when it comes to big business, it's a compromise between growing the vegetables that we eat, using these to give us the most perfect vegetables we get in the stores, to protecting the environment. But I think the environment should win in the long run. Now, I did send today a document that I received, that I requested from the government. I'm sorry it's so late getting to all of you, but you can review it later. I sent a couple of other smaller papers on permethrin. But they do have a couple of statements in them. For instance, for environmental precautions, they specify that it has to state toxic to aquatic organisms, toxic to birds, toxic to bees, toxic to beneficial insects. To minimize, these are also quotes out of this document from the Government of Health Canada. To minimize possible contamination of groundwater, the use of spot treatment applications is recommended in areas where soils are permeable, example, sandy soil, or the depth of the water's table is shallow. To reduce runoff from treated areas into aquatic habitats, avoid application to areas with a moderate to steep slope, compact soil, or clay. Avoid application when heavy rain is forecasted. Contamination of aquatic areas as a result of runoff may be reduced by including a vegetative strip between the treated area and the edge of the water body. Now, this more or less relates to spraying of crops, but when it comes to our lakes, and we have so many of them, we need to protect that area. I feel very strongly about that. And in the statements for the direction of use, it says, do not apply to any body of water. Do not contaminate irrigation or drinking water supplies or aquatic habitats by cleaning of equipment or disposal of the waste related to permethrin. Avoid application of this product when winds are gusting. This is a small sample of Health Canada's revised report. The document deals primarily with the use of permethrin on a large scale basis, such as greenhouses, crop spraying, animal spraying, indoor spraying. It does not appear as though Health Canada sees small-time spraying companies that use small backpacks to spray for mosquitoes as much of a danger to aquatic use. To aquatic, not aquatic use, I meant aquatic life at this time. However, I have personally witnessed on one company spraying at our lake edge, and they were right at the water's edge. It's only a backpack, but it's still just as detrimental. And if we don't put it in the bylaw, it'll come and haunt us quite a bit later. So I'm urging you to include something regarding the use of pesticide. And if we have to meet minimum requirements, I suggest the Canada's recommendation of 10 meters. My choice would be 30 meters. Don't use this pesticide to get rid of mosquitoes. Now, I'm not an expert on permethrin or its use, but I can see a need to head off a future problem so we won't have the issue that we have now. And that is my 2 cents worth to put into this bylaw. I don't have anything else to say, but I hope that they will take it seriously so we can hedge a future problem. Thank you. Your screen is frozen.
I believe Jason is frozen. Looks like he's logged off, and we'll try to log back.
No, I'm sorry. That was my internet not cooperating. So thank you, Mike, and thank you, Nancy. I was saying thank you, and the internet went out. So thanks, Mike, for jumping in there. Okay, Mike, who do we have up next? I believe it's Thomas Moak, is it, up next?
That's
If I'm
correct.
pronouncing his last name correctly?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly, Thomas. How are you?
Great, good, Jason. Thank you. It's pronounced mock, as if it was a K.
Mock. Okay, thank you for that, and my apologies.
We had written a letter, and we started a small group on Cushog Lake because we were concerned and disappointed that our voices weren't being not heard or misrepresented. And I'm happy to hear some of the changes you've made to what we've read already, and hopefully we're optimistic in seeing the changes being put through in a revision. So I wanted to take the opportunity to read a letter that we had sent to you on September 22nd, where within a couple of weeks we had 100 property owners on Cushog that wanted to issue a letter with their signatures. So I've sent a list of the property owners and their addresses for verification. And then today I sent it over to you again, because just in the span of another week, our group has grown over 50%. So we're sitting at 159 signatures on this letter. And you'll find it repetitive to what Kinesis has said. We've gone over their material, and we're on board as I'll just go through it. So to Her Worship Mayor Moffat, councillors and consultants, we're representing approximately 159 property owners on Cushog Lake. There's Kinesis, there's Redstone, Halls, and Little Hawk, and Pelon, if I say that correctly. And as stakeholders directly affected by the proposed Shoreline bylaw, we're very concerned that our views were not being adequately represented in the bylaw that we've read so far. In fact, we felt the consultants had focused their efforts on special interests and lobbyist groups and associations that didn't speak for us. The consultants have gone so far as to interview some umbrella associations whose connection to our property owners seems tenuous at best. We consider the proposed bylaw to be a significant overreach by the municipality and an unnecessary intrusion on our rights as property owners. We're opposed to the bylaw as currently written. as currently framed, as it does not accomplish the intended goal and further restricts our enjoyment of our properties. We submit the following points for your consideration. As you are aware, many of the lakes in Algonquin Highlands are reservoir lakes, such as our own, that feed the Trent water system and have significant level fluctuations throughout the year. Ours is 6 feet or more. And there's various levels of development that go into the lake health throughout the region. The reports that I've read have Cushog very good water quality, a high degree of naturalized shoreline. So what we're saying is that the different lakes have different challenges and need specific remedies. However, the proposed bylaw does nothing to address specific lake issues. Our property ownership rights, and we feel that various federal and provincial laws and regulations overseen by ministries such as M&R and Fisheries and Oceans provide levels of protection to ensure our lake health. And we feel that the existing bylaw, if enforced adequately, also provides that measure of protection we're all looking for. The proposed bylaw is effectively expropriating the most valuable portion of our properties and especially punitive against new property owners. I had one comment from a friend that sent to me. He's looking for, and this is a sentiment that everyone's feeling right now, that the lakes that are most at risk are the oldest lakes that are the most developed. So, you know, being especially punitive to new properties, which make up the minority of properties that will be developed, it does nothing to, or very little, to improve lake quality. Especially to the lakes that are most at risk. So as the proposed bylaw seeks to further reduce our property rights, the language in the bylaw is too vague and overreaching, that making it much more egregious. For example, Part 2, prohibitions, number 1 addresses native vegetation, but doesn't define it. What plants and species are more desirable over others, and what is to be prioritized? Is it native to Haliburton or Ontario? What about established vegetation and the caliber of vegetation? We want to be supportive in an effort to a cause that we're all very interested in. And you know, as Kinesis has already stated, none of us want to destroy what has made us want to buy our properties, work as hard as we do to afford the properties, and come up and enjoy the asset that we're looking to protect. You know, none of our members have expressed, you know, anything less than a sincere appreciation to the nature that we experience when we come to the Haliburton area. So some of the suggestions that we wanted to state is that we feel the municipality should take the lead to make lake health a more public issue and promote educational opportunities for the community. And I noted that in your one of your cards, Jason, and that's very much appreciated, because that we feel that that's very important. No one intentionally goes out to destroy their habitat or affect the lake in a negative context. We believe a positive educational process will be very valuable in the effort that we're all trudging towards. Some of the suggestions include following initiatives: publishing articles in local papers with ideas to assist current owners to renaturalize their properties. And we feel this is the biggest cause. You know, if we focus on existing properties and helping to reestablish the vegetation that has possibly caused the damage that certain lakes are experiencing or putting certain lakes at risk, you know, if you've only got 3 to 5% of the remaining properties as vacant, what's the punitive measure going to do when you've got 95% of the properties overdeveloped? You know, in one of the reports we read, it was common practice, you know, 30 to 50 years ago, just to come in and strip a lot when you wanted to build on it and build your cottage 10, 15 feet away from the shore. You know, it's properties like that, you know, if a lake is at risk, it doesn't happen just overnight. It happens over a significant number of years. And it's these kinds of properties that we need to help come back from where they are, from the damages they've caused, and help promote a healthy shoreline. We're proposing perhaps a lake health ombudsman, somebody dedicated to helping educate people when calls come in, deal with it in a proactive, productive measure. Maybe offering subsidized Indigenous trees, shrubs, and plants at local nurseries. Create a tax rebate program for owners who maintain healthy shorelines or are trying to reestablish native vegetation to assist in renaturalizing their shorelines. We want to create a quantifiable measuring system to assist property owners to renaturalize their shorelines. We think creating another bylaw or more punitive measures on citizens that are trying to do good is not a healthy way for a municipality to proceed. We're seeking to use many proactive tools to promote a unified cooperative environment for property owners who will take pride in having healthy shorelines while avoiding the potentially toxic authoritarian system that does not ultimately contribute to the desired outcome. It just simply leads to animosity among neighbors and our local government. So, that's the gist of our letter. And as I said, it's, as someone that started it because I found that we had members that were speaking for ourselves that did not represent us. You're interviewing and you're hearing people that aren't speaking for us. They say they are, but they're not. So if we can, I had a chat with Carol earlier, and I said to her, I literally got on board with this cause, very short time period ago in the last couple of months, because I didn't like being silenced. And, most everybody that signed on to this letter had the same sentiments. It felt like a repetitive conversation where I said, there's this bylaw. This is what's happening. It's been in the books for a few years now. It's amazing how many property owners just, we're busy in our daily lives, trying to break away from the city to come up to Haliburton. The little tone deaf, I suppose, to the local cause. But we're here now, and we want to be heard, and we want to contribute in a productive way to move forward in everyone's best interests. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Thomas, and I appreciate you coming forward and lending your voice and the voice of your neighbors to the conversation. These are the moments to get involved to ensure that we understand your perspective. So really wanted to say thank you for bringing those perspectives forward to us tonight, for sure.
I want to emphasize, I was very pleased to hear your presentation, as you first started, because it took on a much different tone than when we got involved, and what the current draft of the bylaw is doing. So hopefully we can continue along that path and create a good system.
I think that is the objective, and we look forward to continuing the conversation both with you and your neighbors, Thomas. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.
Bye-bye. So Mike, on my list, I have Brian Doherty next.
Yes, I'll be bringing in Brian shortly.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great. Brian, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you fine, yeah. Can you
Perfect.
see me okay? Can you see me okay?
I can see your name. I don't know about others. I have a 07, Brian Doherty, on my screen.
There
you go.
Okay. All right. Okay. Good evening, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak this evening. My comments are going to be more of a general nature. I've been listening to the other speakers and actually making a few notes as I went along. And I think what I'm going to talk about really kind of dovetails with some of the comments we've heard. But because my name is Brian Doherty. I'm the lake steward for Little Glamour Lake. And those of you who don't know Little Glamour, it's a few kilometers east of Bitterham, just north of Big Glamour Lake. Our lake is relatively small. It measures 2 kilometers by half a kilometer. So I really see the bylaw as a starting point. And I think municipality has, I think everyone has the same objective. We want to protect our water. And so I really see the bylaw as a starting point. I really think more must be done. Actually, some of my comments really of it, like I said, of a general nature and probably relate to septics, et cetera. But it was, I believe the bylaw is important because all of our lakes are under stress, more so today than at any other point. Stress is a result of several factors. Probably one of the more significant ones is everyone is using their cottages more than they used to. I myself am retired. I use my cottage way more than I did in the past when I was working. As people age and population ages and people retire, people are going to be using their cottage more, retiring there full time. And I think the pandemic has only accelerated that process as people realize that working from the cottage is a viable alternative. If I talk about cottage rentals and cottage rentals have been with us all along, but they really have kind of reached new heights. I'm not sure if it's the pandemic or whatever, but on our lake in particular, small lake, 2 of the cottages had 10 adults at each for weeks on end in the summer. So I'm not sure the septic was ever designed for that type of loading. And I really can't fault people for wanting to rent their cottage. For new owners, it's probably the only way they can afford something these days is to that supplemental income. And maybe people have to rent just to keep it in the family. So, but I think the bottom line is that the cottages are going to become more occupied. They're going to become occupied full time year round, more and more properties, and that's just going to increase the stress on the lakes. And we touched on climate change a little bit, and this is anecdotal, but my 20 years in the lake, I think the lake is getting noticeably warmer than it's been in the past. This summer, for example, it was over 80 degrees Fahrenheit on several occasions. Well, that may be great for swimming. It's not so great for the lake. I've also, I anecdotally noticed a significant increase in aquatic weed growth in the past 2 years. Now, we are fortunate to be one of the lakes identified in the Love Your Lake program that has over 75% natural shoreline. Our phosphorus readings have been very stable and well below the danger level. And yet in the fall of 2020, we had 2 blue-green algae blooms. So I'm hoping this was an isolated event, but it does illustrate possibly our lake is going downhill a little, which I hope it's not. Last point, another factor is boat wake. I know there's been talk about boat wake. We're a small lake, and every new boat seems to be bigger and create more wake. And when your lake's only 500 meters wide, that lake doesn't have a lot of opportunity to dissipate before it hits the shorelines. That's that's why protection of the shorelines is so important. In the past open house and this one in particular, some of the speakers were, talked about property rights and government overreach. And, I really do believe that the county and lower tier municipalities have to play a role in protecting our water. Our lakes are a shared resource. And whatever one does on their property, will eventually impact the lake, for the better or for the worse. So I really see the shoreline protection bylaw is a good start. Needs to move ahead. It seems to be it's almost paralysis by analysis. It's been discussed for a long time, and I think there are some very legitimate concerns that have been raised, but I really think it has to move forward. And I understand, one of the local contractors, they're very concerned. I really think they need to be part of the solution. They know what's permitted and what's not permitted. And I think they need to be prepared to say no when somebody wants them to do something that that's in violation of the bylaws, either existing or in the future. And something I just wanted to finish with, if we don't protect if we collectively, as owners, municipalities, don't protect our lakes, no one else will. I think we were gifted with clean, clear lakes by past generations. I just wonder what we want to pass on to our grandkids. Do we want to pass on clean, clear lakes or a green soupy mess? So that's just, I guess that's the comments that I would like to make.
Well, we appreciate that, Brian, very much, and you hanging in there with us to be able to sort of provide your views tonight. So thank you very much, and
no
I
worries.
wish you a good evening.
Yeah, did you want those? Did you want me to email? I can email those into you if you like them for the record.
Yeah, that would be handy. You have I think our email address is on the county's website.
Oh, okay.
If not, we'll find your email address and we'll follow up with you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for
Awesome.
including me this
Thanks.
evening.
Have a great evening.
Okay, thank you.
So, Mike, up next we have Terry Moore.
Yes, we do. And Mr. Moore is joining us by telephone.
Oh, awesome. Hi, Terry. Can you hear us okay? I think you may be on mute, Terry. Okay, let me just go to the mute, unmute. So Terry, I think if you press either *6 or *9 on your phone, you'll unmute yourself. Let me just confirm that for you. I see the mute button has come off. Are you there? Okay, so we've got your hand up, Terry, and you're off mute. Can you hear us okay? Garang, do you have any other advice for Terry in order to ensure that he's heard?
I believe he's unmuted.
Yeah. So Terry, can you hear us? So we can't hear you. I think maybe what we'll do, Garang, can you take Terry's number down maybe and give him a call and you can walk through the technology while we sort of move to the next speaker on the list then? And then we'll come back and we'll bring Terry into the conversation if that's okay. You're okay getting in touch with him, Garang? Awesome. Okay, Terry, Garang's going to call you and talk through the technology piece. In the meantime, we'll move to Al Sinclair. Mike, if we could, please.
Actually, Jason, it looks like Terry may have joined.
Oh, great.
May have joined another method, so I'll see if I can bring him in.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Mike.
Hello, can you hear me?
Terry, there you are. We can hear you loud and clear.
This has been a little frustrating exercise because I joined by two methods, because the first one told me that I would actually be able to change my name and insert it and so on and so forth. And I've been sitting here trying to do that and unable to for the entire time the meeting's been going. So I thought I'd call in as well as a backup. But thank you for hanging in there with me.
Well, thank you. We appreciate your patience.
Okay, so I really appreciate this opportunity to say a few things in this open house tonight and make a number of comments about Environment Haliburton's take on the current state of shoreline preservation discussion and where we may go from here. My name is Terry Moore, and I'm a 40-year seasonal resident of Halls Lake and Algonquin Highlands, which has also been our permanent residence now for about 10 years. I'm the Vice President of Environment Haliburton, an organization that's been involved with education and advocacy work on a wide range of environmental issues in the county for going on 20 years now, including natural shoreline preservation, biodiversity protection, and the promotion of programs to enhance water quality, all under conditions of rising development pressure. So EH's concern, or Environment Haliburton's concern, that the current debate about what a shoreline preservation bylaw ought to contain has become somewhat detached, or maybe disconnected is a better word, from a clear understanding of why and how increased shoreline protection came to occupy such a significant space in the county's public policy agenda in the first place. History is really important. We're equally concerned that much of the public discourse and debate, most of it happening on social media, because there hasn't been really a public forum for groups and organizations to interact among themselves. It's been, one-way communication from people to county council and from county council to people, but no real way for there to be interaction between groups and people that are really, really engaged in this issue. So we're concerned that much of the public debate has been happening without regard to the scientific and best practices reports produced by the consultants to date. Now, I appreciate that those reports only came into County Council in mid-August, and we had a presentation earlier tonight, which would really have been nice to have in advance, or at least some comments with respect to summaries and so on, because then most of us would have been able to frame some comments about those consultant reports. Now we're going to have to, sort of take a step back and redouble our efforts to try to focus on those things. And hopefully have some forum to exchange views about that, because there's been some things said tonight which I think need to have discussion, because they're not entirely, from our perspective, accurate. And so they need to be. They would really benefit from an engagement about what our understandings of the facts, best practices, and scientific sort of consensus around shoreline protection is. I'd like to make a couple of brief comments about the concerns that I've just raised, and then end by offering a couple of suggestions for possible improvements going forward. With respect to our first concern about discussion and debate being detached from how we got to where we are, we think it's worth remembering that we're here largely because the state of our natural shorelines, as revealed by the 4-year Love Your Lake Shoreline Assessment Project. That study was financed by the Trillium Foundation and carried out by the Coalition of Haliburton Property Owners Associations, or the CHA, in partnership with its member lake associations, Watersheds Canada, and Trent University. And it constitutes the best evidence we have of the actual on-the-ground state of our shorelines across the most developed lakes in this county. The Love Your Lake project assessed over 12,000 individual properties across some 50 lakes, encompassing almost 1,000 kilometers of shoreline. That's 20% of the distance across this country, almost 20%. The composite picture arising out of the Love Your Lake project reveals a natural shoreline reduced to an average of only 47% of the circumference of assessed lakes, far below the scientific and best practices target of 75%. Natural shorelines, that the best science, as summarized in the consultant's report, tells us are fundamental to the protection of the healthy function of shorelines, are actually not in a great state of affairs in this county. That's where we think we should be starting. Why are we even talking about a bylaw? Well, it's because in the wake of the Love Your Lake project, there was a number of reports actually to County Council, and County Council asked the question, how can we help? How can we help, move from where we are to closer to where we should be? So in our view, the on the ground facts on the state of Haliburton's natural shorelines, together with the 2 consultant reports on the best available science and the planning practices, clearly supports a 30-meter setback and a prior review process for projects that have the potential to contribute to continuing decline of our natural shorelines. The impact of development on individual shoreline properties does not stop, and I think a number of people have mentioned this, at the property line. What happens on every part of our county shoreline contributes to the cumulative impact on entire lakes and watersheds. The desire to protect individual private property rights has to be somehow reconciled with community standards that prevent individual actions unintentionally from undercutting the health of what we all collectively hold in common. Nobody believes in Environment Haliburton that anybody goes out to intentionally undermine lake water quality or shoreline health. It's the unintended consequences of those actions which come home to haunt us, just like it does with respect to climate change. All of us are privileged to live and play in this incredible piece of paradise. And we've been drawn here by the quality of the natural environment, its healthy lakes and water quality, and ownership of that little piece of paradise comes with an obligation from our point of view to help steward the whole and pass it on to future generations in the better condition, in as best a condition as possible, hopefully better than we found it. So in closing, I want to make two suggestions for how the excessively polarized and vitriolic debate on shoreline property, shoreline protection, that's largely been happening, perhaps out of your view, although I don't think so, on social media. It's been vitriolic in the extreme. And many of us have been subjected to the kind of comment and commentary that nobody would want to subject anybody to, I don't think. But from our perspective, there needs to be more opportunities for people to share their concerns and issues around the content of any shoreline preservation bylaw in a manner that's grounded in fact, not fear, science, not social media hyperbole or weaponized rhetoric. We have had far too much of that so far, and it's having a real chilling effect in our community and our capacity to talk across organizational lines. There's much of what I've heard tonight from people who have serious concerns about the bylaw where there's common ground. There's a bunch of common ground, but how do we actually talk to each other about that unless that conversation is organized by the county? By the county, public education and information sessions focused on the history of what brought us to this point and the actual state of Haliburton's natural shorelines. By the way, in lots of the social media coverage, I've heard lots of quotes of the Love Your Lake process, of the Love Your Lake results, which are completely factually incorrect. But I've got no way to have a conversation with anybody so that we can actually arrive at what are the facts and share our sources and come to some kind of mutually agreeable conclusion, either to agree to disagree or that we can share the data upon which our views are based. So we need to organize, I think, public discussion forums where we can actually talk about where we're coming from and why, and see what the prospects are for common ground. Secondly, in order to facilitate that, summary background material written in everyday language and readily available on the County Shoreline Preservation Bylaw website can help all those with an interest in shoreline preservation find the information and hopefully some of the answers that they're actually looking for without speculating on social media. With, you know, there's lots of material available. Some people have talked about finding information on native plants. Well, guess what? The CHA's website is got a ton of information about how you can relate your slope, your soil conditions, and so on and so forth to the kinds of native plants that you might consider planting on your shoreline if you want to restore certain areas that have been degraded. But finally, and most importantly, when a new draft bylaw is written and tabled for discussion, we desperately need to have it accompanied by a Coles Notes version, written for, not for lawyers, but for real people, everyday folk, and for that to come out before any discussion gets to the county council level. You know, there's been so much misinformation out there. I still get vitriolic Facebook posts directed at me saying, how dare you support a bylaw that would retroactively make me tear down all my buildings within the 30-meter setback? How dare you, Terry Moore, suggest that? You're actually expropriating my property. That was never in the previous draft bylaw. And I can say that once, twice, 100 times, and maybe you have too. But you know what? That doesn't substitute for a kind of public engagement process where that kind of concern and view can be tracked down and can be answered with the correct information. The kind of behind the scenes vitriolic tensions in the community could have been avoided, in my view, with an aggressive public educational process that happened earlier in the process, much earlier in the process. So how do we go forward? Well, I think that we have the time, we should take the time to do it right this time in terms of public engagement. We need to have opportunities and forums for people to talk across organizational lines. We need to have people who are opponents because they think that it fundamentally undermines private property rights, to be able to talk to those people who believe that we absolutely have to do something to protect the shorelines from future decline, because our entire economy and community floats on that water quality in the lakes. It literally is the basis of our economy going now and going forward. And I think everybody recognizes that, but they haven't connected the dots between the on-the-ground reality and the fact that what we have on in terms of bylaws and so on and so forth haven't done the job. The 2012 Shoreline Protection or Preservation Tree Preservation Bylaw has not done the job. It's an after-the-fact complaint-based process where neighbors have to rat out neighbors. I can tell you that from my experience on the Halls and Hawk Lakes Property Owners Association, that will not happen. It's not going to happen. We need a permitting process that takes a look in advance and screens out those or modifies those programs that are going to have a potential for significantly undermining the health of shorelines. Okay, so those are, I had a lot more to say, but I was told it was 5 minutes, and I probably have gone by the 5-minute limit. There's going to be hopefully lots of opportunity for us to engage in hopefully constructive conversation about the bylaw, the need for it, and what it should contain going down the road. There's been a whole bunch that I've heard tonight that I could agree with, coming from surprising places. And I'd like to be surprised more. And I'd like to have the opportunity, and I ask County Council to provide those opportunities where folks like me can be surprised more, and we can try to find some common ground on what's been an incredibly divisive issue. Thank you for allowing me to do some presentation tonight. And I hope that there's going to be other opportunities in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry. We appreciate you sharing your perspective with us tonight. Okay, Mike, so I guess next we have Al.
Just a quick question, if I might, is the group willing to push through, or would you like to have a 5 or 10 minute break? How many more speakers do we have, Jason?
We have approximately 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because Deborah just emailed to say that she's here. So we have 5 speakers, Madam Warden.
Would everyone agree to a 5-minute break so that we're not making anyone wait for too long? Okay, thanks very much. Okay, we'll give Walt another 30 seconds and then there we go. Thanks, Walt. We can get started again. Jason, thanks.
Thank you very much, Warden Danielson. So during the break, we had a slight change in the speaker list with some folks emailing in. So next we will go to Steve Walker, if we could please, Mike.
I am bringing Steve in now.
Can everybody hear me?
Can hear you great. Steve, how are you?
Perfect. I'm doing well. Yourself?
Very well, thank you.
Okay. First, I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you tonight. My family is I'm a second generation cottager. My family's owned a cottage on the South Basin of Couchog for 60 plus years now. I'm going to try to keep this concise because I know it's getting a little late, but I do believe there is a need for reform of shoreline preservation, and there's 3 points I would like to raise. The first off is the discussion of the buffer, the 30 meters that's being outlined in this draft bylaw. I understand that from an undeveloped lot, if I was to want to develop a cottage on it or a residence, looking at a 30-meter setback. So I understand the buffer is basically from the high water mark to the front edge of the building. If you are familiar with, again, the South Basin of Couchog, a lot of long-established properties there. Other than some recent new development, I would kind of challenge anybody to go find a cottage or a building that is farther back than 30 meters. Most would be partially or fully within that 30-meter buffer zone. So with that in mind, talking about the buffer and setback, and comments that I've had from others that are very concerned about the 30 meters relative to their location of the building on their property, and myself included. My property is very shallow depth-wise. I would suggest they consider creating a buffer zone that's pliable to the property, that is from the high water mark to the front edge of an existing, a permitted illegal structure. That may be, if a buffer zone is going to be put into effect, that may be the fairest for the general population. Second thing I would like to bring up is just existing development. And when I talk about existing development, I'm talking about shoreline, and the shoreline, not the 30 meters, but that transition point from the water to the land, primarily at the high water mark or close to. A lot of cottages in our area over time, people have developed or created features along the water edge, again, primarily at that high water mark. Stone, like gravity walls, retaining walls, riprap, that kind of thing, primarily to protect the property from the, again, at that point, at least in our area of the lake, is the transition from the bedrock to the soil coverage. So when the water level is high, that's when we get the most damage occurring right at that waterfront. A lot of these walls in place prevent that, and this year has been a great example. I've seen that the water level stayed high for much longer than typical, and I know that's controlled by the Trent system. But areas where people have had some sort of protective feature or measure in place hasn't seen any erosion or damage. Areas in proximity to our cottage where it's vacant property, there's been noticeable erosion and wear under the waterfront, like trees, that sort of thing. the soil is definitely eroded away from that prolonged higher water level. And I think, as other people have mentioned, larger boats, larger waves have contributed to that. So I think I appreciate the shoreline preservation from runoff from septic systems, from herbicides, pesticides, that sort of thing. But there's also shoreline preservation from the damage caused by, again, extended elevated water levels and waves from some of these larger boats. And then the third thing I wanted to bring up is there's an exclusion on that I'd be free to cut down any tree that's 5 centimeters or less, so 2 inches. I live in Waterloo region, and here I would require a permit for anything 20 centimeters at basically at chest height, or 8 inches, which may be a bit on the large side, but again, with my depth of my lot, the 30-meter buffer zone and that 5 centimeter restriction, we do plant several trees, but if I wanted to take my family out and harvest an evergreen as a Christmas tree, I would, according to this new bylaw, I would have to go and incur the expense and get a permit to cut down a half decent Christmas tree. So I think that 5 centimeters may be a little bit on the light side. Again, 20 centimeters, you can get, that's a pretty big tree. So I'm thinking somewhere between the two would probably be a more workable number. But anyway, those are the 3 points that I wanted to bring up, and just tried to keep it concise. So I want to thank everybody for their time, and we can move on to the next person.
Well, thank you, Steve. We appreciate you hanging in there with us and
No
for
problem.
taking the time to share your views. Thanks. You have a great night.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Take care.
You too.
So, Mike, up next we have Kimberly Ferris, I believe.
Kimberly is no longer on the call.
Okay.
Dave Bright still appears to be here, joining us by telephone.
Okay. So why don't we see if we can bring Dave in, if he's still with us. Hi, Dave, are you there? I know, Mike, we had received an email earlier from Dave indicating that he had to jump off, so I'm wondering if he's sort of still on mistakenly, or?
It's possible that it didn't refresh the participant list.
Okay. So do you know if Deborah Bassler has since joined us, Mike?
She has not.
She has not. Okay. So I believe that then concludes the list of registered speakers that we had for this evening. I think up next we were going to go back to the participant list to see if anybody wanted to sort of provide a view who hadn't had an opportunity to do so already. So I'm just checking the attendee list to see if anybody had their hand up. I don't see any. So with County Council's indulgence, maybe if you'll permit me, we did receive one email today from a gentleman who would like to have his email read into the record. So we had received an email from Larry Tompkins, who lives on 12 Mile Lake, earlier today. And Larry writes, to start with an old cliche, all our actions on this earth have consequences. And sorry, while I just make the screen a little bit bigger on my end. Have consequences. So I say to the following groups: to all Haliburton property owners, and more specifically lakefront owners, we are the caretakers of the land we allegedly own. Changes that are made have both a positive and negative impact on the land and/or the lake. So let's agree to reduce or eliminate the impact of negative changes with positive changes. The people who can tell us are the scientists that have, studying the negative changes that have happened over the last 100 years, because if we don't change in the next 50 years, it will be gone. To the lake owners that have lakes still above the 75% natural shoreline, I commend you. Are you also prepared to attend every committee of adjustment meeting, building permit application to understand what, if any, negative changes are been made so your lakes can stay at a 75% natural rate? To all contractors, landscape contractors, and handymen, let's be honest with each other and admit that you do not want to tell a client that the negative changes they want or propose should or cannot be done. They are paying you a lot of money to make their dream come true. Also, the fear that the new bureaucracy will create delays and cost money. Unfortunately, this is just a fact of life, and you need to help your clients achieve their dreams the natural way, so the legacy they want to leave to their children and grandchildren will be there for them. And yes, not all clients want to play by the rules. To all of our county officials, you need to act now and approve a bylaw to protect the lakes as they are today, a bylaw that can and will be enforced. That means hiring qualified staff to review and decide a course of action based on the negative impact of development will have on the land before permits are issued or minor variances are granted. Let's not say no to new development, but develop with nature. This is why many move to Haliburton County to enjoy its natural beauty and healthy lakes. Signed, Larry Tompkins and 12 Mile Lake. So with that, Warden Danielson, that concludes the open house for tonight. In terms of next steps, I think we've certainly heard an awful lot of feedback, really good feedback tonight. I know that I have personally taken over 8 pages of notes. So wanting to say again, thank you to everybody who has come to share their perspectives with us. We will obviously take an opportunity to reflect on the perspectives that we've heard this evening and take those into consideration as we sort of continue our work to preparing a new bylaw for county council's consideration. So my thanks to everybody who spoke, to my colleagues, Brent, Andrea, and Garang. And I neglected to do this last time. And I do wanted to thank Mike March for all of his behind the scenes support to make sure that this open house went as successful as it did. So thank you very much, Mike, for your support as well. With that, Warden Danielson, I'll turn it back over to you if I can. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jason, and to all of you at J.L. Richards and Hutchinson Environmental, including Andrea. My apologies for not introducing you earlier. You know, good work. It's really great to hear from the public and hear the different perspectives, and I'm sure that all members of County Council can attest to the fact that we continue to get emails and phone calls from all types of individuals, and we are hearing from everybody, whether positive or negative. I'd hate to hear anyone think that we're not listening to all voices, because I believe that we are. I'd like to thank all members of County Council for their patience this evening. I know it's been a long evening after a long day. Councillor Roberts, you had a comment or question?
Just the chat box popped up and the Director of Planning said there is that Deborah, I didn't have her last name, is trying to sign on. So I just, if you read the chat box.
Thank you for that. So Mike, is Deborah on the call then, or?
No, she still isn't on the call.
Okay, well, we do have Deborah's contact information. So if it is okay with you, Warden Danielson, maybe we can follow up with Deborah after the meeting to sort of ensure that we have her perspective as well.
Thanks very much. I think that'd be the best course of action. Okay, having said that, could I have a mover and a seconder for the confirming bylaw for this evening? Councillor Roberts and Councillor Moffat, thank you.
Moved by Councillor Roberts, seconded by Councillor Moffat, be it resolved that bylaw 4067, being the bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the September 29th, 2021 special meeting of Haliburton County Council be considered to be read a first, second, third time, finally passed, and the seal of the corporation be affixed.
You were very hard to hear, Mike. Does anyone want that repeated, or are we good with the, you'd like it repeated? Please.
Sorry, I have trouble with this mic. Be it resolved that bylaw 4067, being a bylaw to confirm the proceedings of the September 29th, 2021 special meeting of Haliburton County Council be considered to be read a first, second, third time, finally passed, and the seal of the corporation be affixed.
All in favor? That's carried. Thank you. And a mover and a seconder to adjourn. Councillor Schell and Councillor Moffat.
Moved by Councillor Schell, seconded by Councillor Moffat, be it resolved that the September 29th, 2021 special meeting of Haliburton County Council be adjourned.
All in favor? That's carried. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you. Night, everyone.
Night all.